Afidliken, and hello, it's Fo, and welcome to Magic Mondays. This week we're going to have a look at deck building. In Magic the Gathering, each player constructs a deck to face their opponent with. It's a vital part of the game, and in duels we do it by looking at our card collection. Then we click on My Decks down in the bottom right corner. From here we can create a new deck. The first time you build a deck on duels, I would recommend using the deck wizard. It tries to ensure that you include the right amount of spells and lands in your deck. Then once you're more experienced, move on to using just a deck builder. In this example, we're going to build a green creature deck. So what we need to do is filter the cards so we can have a look at only the green cards. As you can see, we can filter by color. What we're going to do is we're going to select green. We don't need to see any of the other colors. We're also going to choose this one with an X in it. This is colorless, like artifacts. We can obviously cast them with any color, so it's valuable. We may have a few that can go in our deck. Some land cards generate colorless mana, and so the last field is for cards that require colorless mana as part of the casting cost. For this example, we're just going to keep it simple and go with just the green ones. In the second page, what we can do is we can narrow it down further, and we can narrow it down to say the mythic rares and the rares, as these are usually the most powerful cards there are. When we click apply, it'll show us all 116 cards that match our criteria. We can zoom in on any of the cards, we can read it, we can have a look at the abilities, then we can decide whether it's a good fit for our deck. Old Mrs. Bashiri here is a green creature. She's great, but she also can create more creatures with her ability. This makes her an ideal candidate for our deck. You can see we have 2 copies of her, so what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and add both copies into our deck. It's important to have a few 1-drops, perhaps a few 2-drops, a few 3-drops, early game plays that we can make with our deck, rather than having to wait until we've got 6 or 7 land to start casting creatures out. Next we've got Greenbelt Rampager. Does cost 1, power and toughness is great, but the mechanics of getting energy, spending energy, it's a sub-theme, and it's not something we're going to focus on. All of the sub-themes, there's a few in these sets, energy sub-themes, delirium, there's a few abilities that are quite specific to building a deck around those abilities, and so we're not going to use them. We're just going to keep things simple and have creatures that make more creatures, or creatures that benefit other creatures. Just a great big army of big green guys. So we're going to have a look here. Oath of Nyssa. Oath of Nyssa is good. It's a 1-drop spell, we can play it on turn 1, and it helps us get another land, and we want lots of land. So it's a good candidate. Also lets us look for potentially a planeswalker instead of a land, and that's good if we're going to play a planeswalker. We're probably going to play Nyssa, so we should probably include it in the deck, and then have a little look further down the road to see if we're going to include Nyssa in the deck. If not, we can maybe take it out for something else. Now this spell lets us go looking for land. That seems good, but we can't play it on turn 1 because it has X as part of the casting cost. X spells, generally you can pay as much as you can afford, as much as you want. It's optional how much you spend on X, but if you spend 0 on X, the spell is going to have no effect. We look at the top 0 cards of our library and get to put 0 lands into play. So late game, when you've got enough land to make this a great spell, and have a look at 7 or 8 cards, you've already got enough land and you don't really need any more. The spell's inefficient, it's not great, so I'm not going to include this one in our deck. Moving on to the 2-drops, our next option, again we're not going to include this guy, Deathcap Cultivator. You can tap to give 1 green or 1 black mana. This is like a mana dork, they call them. A small creature that's cheap to cast that you can tap to get an additional mana, so you can ramp up to playing bigger spells. To save on a little time, I'll take you through the cards that we are going to include and not show you any of the other cards that we're not going to include. But generally the reasons are that the card's inefficient or really circumstantial. A 2-cost creature we are going to put in our deck is Sylvan Advocate. Sylvan Advocate's great because he's got vigilance. That means he doesn't tap when he attacks. He's got good power and toughness for his cost. And when we get more lands into play, his ability triggers and he becomes bigger. Next, in our 3-drop slot, we're going to put in Nyssa Vastwood Seer. And this is the creature Nyssa. The card represents the transformation from a creature into a planeswalker. When she comes into play, we get to go looking for a forest in our deck, put it into our hand, and then when we play our 7th forest, she transforms from the creature into the planeswalker by flipping the card around. Once transformed into the Sage Animist, Nyssa's got 3 abilities. Remember, we can only play one of these abilities per turn, but we can play one on the first turn. So we can either +1 to go looking at the top card of our library. If it's a land, we get it straight into play, regardless of if we've already played a land this turn. Or if it's not a land, we get to put it in our hand, and we've got the option of casting it anyway if we can afford it. We're generally always going to use this one to generate card advantage, but we can also use the negative ability to generate a 4/4 creature token, and that can help us if we're down on creatures. Her ultimate ability also generates creature advantage by turning 6 of our lands into creatures that can also attack and block. The next 3-drop is a god. Gods are generally indestructible, which means they can't be destroyed by lethal damage or destroy effects that say on it destroy. It can be exiled, it can be removed from the game entirely, and that's the kind of spell that an opponent's going to need to play on us in order to get rid of this card. Very strong. His power and toughness is great. His drawback is that you can't attack or block with him unless you have another creature that has power 4 or more. This deck is going to include plenty of creatures with power 4 or more, and he himself has an ability that he can boost one of our smaller creatures, and then he can lift his own restriction. Next is Nyssa, Voice of Zendikar, also a 3-drop. This is straight up Planeswalker version of Nyssa. Doesn't need to flip, there's no special conditions. But this is Nyssa a little bit later on in her career, we'll say, which is a bit more grown up. So has different abilities. The ability we like here, the +1, is to generate a 0/1 creature. Gives us more creature advantage. Gives us lots of little blockers if we don't have our indestructible god as a blocker. Her negative ability lets us put a +1/+1 counter on all of our creatures, which is great. And our ultimate ability lets us draw cards and gain life, which is handy because we don't have much of that going on yet. In duels, the planeswalkers are considered legendary, so we can't have both Nyssas out at the same time. We'll put it in the deck, but what it means is that we only really want one of the Nyssas at any one time. Next up, Tireless Tracker gives us great card advantage by letting us draw a card at the cost of 2 and sacrificing a token that's generated by Tireless Tracker whenever we put a land into play. Every time we sacrifice a clue, we put a +1/+1 counter on Tireless Tracker, making him an increasingly bigger threat. What's not to love about a cat snake? What a great creature type. This guy's got good power and toughness for his casting cost, helps turn Ronus on, our god, and its effect's great. It can't be countered by our opponents, and then none of our following creatures can be countered by our opponents. It's conditional, but if our opponent is playing blue, it can really throw them off. And even if they're not, then it's still another good body on the field. Into the 4-drop slot, we're going to put From Beyond. It's an enchantment, and it's multifunctional. At the beginning of our upkeep, so the start of our turn after we've cast it, it'll start generating a token every turn. And this token can be used as a blocker, it's a 1/1 creature, but it can also be sacrificed to gain a colorless mana to help us ramp up to those heavier costing spells, those bigger creatures. It also has the additional bonus that we can sacrifice the enchantment itself to go and look for an Eldrazi card and put that into our hand. The Eldrazi are heavy costing large creatures, so there's a good chance we'll want to look for one, and we're going to include one in our deck. 5 mana gets us a Verdurous Gearhulk. It's a green artifact creature. It's got 4/4 and trample, but when it comes into play, you can put 4 +1/+1 counters on any of your creatures. So even if he was the only creature you had, and you had to put all the counters on him, he'd still become an 8/8 trample. For 6, we can cast the Green Warden of Marasa. He's again a decent large creature for his casting cost, but his ability is what we want him for really. Whenever he comes into play, we can get any of our previously destroyed cards back from the graveyard, back into our hands so we can cast them again. This also happens when he dies. Also 6 is the Woodland Bellower. Whenever he comes into play, we get to go looking for a small creature with mana cost 3 or less and get him straight into play, so we don't need to pay for him. So we get to look for him and put him straight into play, again giving us the creature advantage. Ulvenwald Hydra is an amazing creature. Fills the 6-drop slot again, but when it comes into play, you get to go looking for your 7th land and put that directly into play tapped. Its power and toughness are equal to the number of lands you control, so at minimum it's a 7/7. It's got reach, so it can block flying creatures, and a lot of times that ability can save your life. His predecessor is the Oran Reef Hydra. It's a 5/5 trample for the same cost, but it has a landfall ability. Whenever we lay a land, a +1/+1 counter gets put on the Hydra. If it's a forest, it gets 2 +1/+1 counters. And as all of our lands are going to be forests, it's a no-brainer. Although we don't want everything costing 3 or 6, we're going to add one more 6-drop, Nyssa's Renewal. It lets us look for 3 lands and put them directly into play tapped, which gives us 3 landfall triggers. And on top of that, it gains us 7 life back, which helps us in the late game. If we're pretty far behind, it can save our life. Aetherwind Basker is a 7/7 trample for 7. Whenever he comes into play, you count how many creatures you've got, you get that much energy. When he comes to attacking, you get that much energy again, and at any time you can spend as many energy as you want to give him +1/+1 till end of turn. And he has trample, so he can end the game by just, if you have enough creatures out, he can gain as much energy as he needs to just trample right through your opponent's blockers and win the game. So we're going to pop him in. Even better than our Hydra with reach is this enchantment that stops all creatures with flying from attacking you altogether. It also generates a 5/5 creature token during your end step to help you maintain the creature advantage. It does cost 8, but it can really turn some games around. Now we're into the rare and mythic rare artifacts. Our first one we're going to add in is Walking Ballista. It's a rare artifact creature, and it costs X, which means if you wanted X to be 1, you're going to have to pay 2. If you want X to be 2, you're going to have to pay 4. If you want X to be 4, you're going to have to pay 8. So, it comes into play with X +1/+1 counters on it. You can pay 4 colorless mana to add a counter onto it, and at any time you can take a counter off to deal 1 damage to a creature or player. And you can do it multiple times at any time. Because our spells go looking for land, this will be how we get rid of our opponent's creatures. Heart of Kieran is a vehicle. It only costs 2, but it can become a 4/4 flying creature if we can tap our creatures in order to accrue the vehicle, or we can remove a loyalty counter from a planeswalker to accrue the vehicle. A 4/4 flying vigilance is pretty strong, and with 2 planeswalkers in the deck, there's a high chance we're going to be able to pay that alternative cost in order to accrue it. We're also going to add Smuggler's Copter. Again, it's a 2-drop flying vehicle, but when it attacks or blocks, we get to draw a card, then discard a card. And that's very handy, helping us filter away all our massive creatures if we need a land, or filter away our lands if we need a massive creature. Lifecrafter's Bestiary is a 3-drop artifact that lets us scry at the beginning of our turn, and whenever we cast a creature spell, which we're more than likely going to do, then we get to pay 1 green if we have it optional on top to draw an extra card. Card advantage on top of creature advantage is just massive. At 5, it's more expensive than our other flying vehicles, but the Sky Sovereign is clearly the best. Whenever it comes into play, it deals 3 damage to a creature or a planeswalker that our opponent controls, and then when it attacks, it does the same thing. It can't attack straight away if you make it a creature the turn you play it, because it'll have Summoning Sickness as a creature. But assuming you can crew it every turn, you can swing in, dealing 3 damage and wiping away your opponent's army. Oblivion Soar is another 6-drop, but his power and toughness is amazing for the cost, and whenever he comes into play, you get to exile the top 4 cards of your opponent's library. If any of those cards are land, they come straight into play, untapped, on your side. It's an Eldrazi, so we can look for it with our enchantment that we can sacrifice to go and look for an Eldrazi. So we can reliably play this mid to late game, helps us get the extra land, and we're robbing our opponent of a few cards. And he's a great blocker. So all round, great card, Oblivion Soar, really good 6-drop. Right at the top of the mana curve is Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger. He costs 10 mana to cast. We should be able to get enough land to get up there to play him when we get him, and if we had that enchantment again we can sacrifice it and go looking for Ulamog. If we let that enchantment run a few turns, so we've got the Scions, the little tokens that we can sacrifice for colourless mana, then they can help if we sacrifice them all to make up the difference, to make up to 10 mana to cast Ulamog. He is arguably the most powerful creature in all of Duels. When we cast him, we can exile any 2 cards from the game. If our opponent is well behind on lands, we can even exile their lands to leave them even further behind. He's indestructible, he's a 10/10, and whenever he attacks, our opponents have to exile the top 20 cards of their library. Most decks are only 60 cards, so it's only a maximum of 3 attacks before all our opponent's cards would be gone, they would be unable to draw a card, and they would lose the game that way. And that's if they can block him swinging in for 10. If we cast the Oblivion Soar after Ulamog's made an attack, then we get all of the lands in that entire pile of cards that have been exiled. So potentially 7 or 8 lands can come into play on your turn if you play them the other way around. If you play the Ulamog first, attack with it, and then lay the Oblivion Soar. But most of the time, you'll be laying the Oblivion Soar to steal a few lands from your opponent to help you get up to playing the Ulamog. But it depends which order you would draw the cards. Our other 10-drop is also an Eldrazi, the Decimator of the Provinces, another great name. So it's a 7/7 trample, and when you cast it, all of your creatures get +2/+2 and trample until end of turn. So it's a big finisher. Even if you have lots of little creatures, suddenly them getting 2/2 and trample is enough that if you swing in with everyone, it can finish the game. It also has the ability we can emerge, so we can sacrifice a creature to reduce that cost. If we've got no hope of making it up to 10 mana, but we've got this guy in our hand, we've got options that we could sacrifice a creature that cost 4, say, and that would take 4 off the emerge cost, and then we could play this creature out for cheaper. Before we move on to the uncommons and commons, we're going to make a couple of refinements. We're going to take out the Basker. It's conditional. We might get all our creatures destroyed and he's the only creature we've got, at which point it doesn't have great value. Also, I think we're going to take out the Planeswalker Nyssa and keep in the creature Nyssa that flips into a Planeswalker. If we end up with 2 Nyssas in play at the same time, the game will make us choose to keep one and sacrifice the other. Because they're a legendary character, they can only appear once on your side. You can't have multiple copies of them. So we're going to get rid of this one, then we're going to keep the other one, because the other one gives us card advantage, and it helps us draw extra lands that we need for our bigger creatures. It's better than getting many small creatures. So if we go back into the filter, put on uncommons, take away the rares and mythics we've already looked at, then we can see if we can make up the rest of our deck in uncommons. We've got 26 out of 60, we need to make it up to about 35, so we need about 9 cards to add into the deck and we'll be done. What we really want is a Jadi Offshoot. 1-drop, fantastic creature. It's a 0/3 wall, it has defender so it can't attack, but it's a good blocker, and whenever you lay a land once he's in play, you gain a life. And that's going to help you. If you get him out in turn 1, you're going to be able to lay so many lands after that, gain a life for each land, and it's going to keep you in the game long enough for you to cast out those big creatures. So we're going to put in 2 Jadi Offshoots. Can't recommend them enough for any green deck generally. Primal Bellow is a combat trick, costs only 1 green, and it gives any one of our creatures +1/+1 for each forest we control until end of turn. Because we're only playing with forests, it's going to mean a massive bonus to anybody we put it on. Definitely going to include one of those. Next to it, another combat trick we might want to add is Blossoming Defense. Blossoming Defense makes our creature a little bit tougher to land a turn, and it gives it hexproof. So it can help it in a battle, and it can also help it against spells being cast against it. If our opponent casts a removal spell, we can play that in response, meaning the spell now has an illegal target and won't resolve, saving our creature's life. Nature's Way is not quite removal, not quite a combat trick, but somewhere in between. It's a sorcery, so we can't play it in the middle of combat, but it does give one of our creatures vigilance and trample until end of turn, and lets us do damage equal to the power of that creature to a potential blocker on our opponent's side, helps us remove one of those creatures. Since we don't have very much removal in this deck, only Walking Ballista so far, and perhaps the Sky Sovereign if it can swing in, then we're going to add 2 Nature's Way. Reclamation Sage is essential in some matchups. It destroys target enchantment or artifact when it enters the battlefield, and there are many evil enchantments that we don't want to be facing. Retreat to Kazandu is another landfall card. It's an enchantment. Whenever we lay a land, we can either gain 2 life or put a +1/+1 counter on a creature we control. So even if we don't have any creatures, we can still gain 2 life for every land, and that'll keep us around until the late game. Plated Crusher is another good 7-drop, 7/6 trample, and it's hexproof. So if our opponent is playing a removal heavy deck and they're killing all of our creatures one by one, when we get to that guy, he can't be killed because he can't be the target of our opponent's spells or abilities. Ronus's Monument lets us cast our green creatures for 1 colorless less, and whenever a creature comes into play on our side, we can give one of our creatures +2/+2 and trample till end of turn. We're pushing it because we're up to 36 cards, and we really don't want to go down to 24 land to make up our 60 card deck, but we'll add it in just now, and then we'll decide what to take out when we've added everything that we want, and then realise how many cards we're going to have to take out. The only non-forest land I think we're going to play is Rogue's Passage. Rogue's Passage is an uncommon land. We can tap 4, and one of our creatures is unblockable until end of turn. So it gives us a free attack in that our opponent can do nothing about. If it's with a big enough creature, it's well worth the 4 mana and tapping the land to achieve the effect. And we can always just use it as a land to get 1 colorless if we absolutely have to. So we have at least 2 cards too many, and we're going to need room for 4 or 5 common cards that help us look for more land. So we're going to have to make a couple of cuts. We're going to take out the Plated Crusher, because it's not as good as the Decimator of the Provinces or Ulamog. Hexproof is good, but just doesn't have the same value the others do. We need to cut a couple of 6-drops. Nyssa's Renewal gains a 7 life, but I think we can gain that life over the course of a few turns with a few Jadi offshoots in our return to Kazandu. Also, we're going to swap it out for a couple of smaller spells that help us get a few more land, so we don't have to wait until we're at 6 mana to suddenly get a lot of land in. Woodland Bellower is also a little bit greedy. I think we can cut this out. We definitely have too many 6-drops. We only get maximum value out of the Green Warden if we've got a few cards in our graveyard that we really need back. So I think we can cut him as a 6-drop as well. I think we'd rather get extra lands into play than make everything cheaper, because it triggers all our landfall abilities. So we're going to get rid of the Monument as well. We'll take out a couple more things just to make some extra room. We can always put them back in afterwards. We're going to go down 1 Nature's Way. Might not need 2. If our opponent's not playing any creatures, they're playing a spells deck, then we're definitely going to not need it, you know. I think also we're going to get rid of the Heart of Kieran. Now we're down to just that 1 Planeswalker that comes from a creature. We don't have multiple options of how we're going to crew it, so it could be useless to us in some situations. So we'll cut that out. We'll stick with our Smuggler's Copter and our Sky Sovereign. Now we're down to 29 non-land cards. We need about 35, so we can go have a look at the commons, see if we can add in 6 commons, If not, we'll add in a couple of commons, come back and add a couple more copies of the cards that we've already got here, like Walking Ballista, or we'll add in some of the cards that we just removed. So if we turn on the commons, turn off the uncommons, and then go back to apply, we can have a little look. We really only want to look for a few key spells that are going to go let us look for a couple more lands to play. We've got a few options in green, but Nyssa's Pilgrimage is the one that we want. It's our best option. For 3 mana, it lets us go looking for 2 forests, one to put directly into play tapped, and one to put in our hand to play either this turn if we haven't already laid a land, or next turn if we have. If we have Spell Mastery, which means we've already got a couple of instants or sorceries in our graveyards already, that means we get to go looking for 3 forests, one to come into play tapped, and 2 to go into our hand. But again, that's only if we've already played 2 instants or sorceries before we play this spell. We're going to add 3 out of the 4 copies, and that's going to give us a better chance of finding it early game when we especially need it. Because we've already got 1 land, we're going to add in 24 forests, and that makes it up to our 25 land. We've got 32 non-land cards in there, so we get to put 3 cards in after we've put the land in, and we can decide which 3 we want to add in. Other decks may need less land if the cards in them have a lower average converted mana cost. If everything costs 1 or 2 in the deck, you probably only want about 20 lands. In the vast majority of decks, you'll never see more than 25 land or less than 20, but of course there are some crazy decks out there with exceptions to this rule. So we're going to go back up to 2 Nature's Way as we intended. We're going to add a second Retreat to Kazandu. The 4th Nyssa's Pilgrimage to complete the set and our deck. If we click on the icon down at the bottom in the centre, we can see statistics for the deck. If we click on the little cogwheel icon in the middle, then it'll bring us up options to give the deck a persona. We can choose, say, Nyssa, because it's going to be a green deck and it's got Nyssa in it. Nyssa is one of the characters that we can pick. There she is. So we'll pick Nyssa. Then we choose a background for our avatar. Pick the greenest one that we can find. There we go. Then we get to choose sleeves for the cards. Obviously, they don't need sleeves because they're only digital, but why not? Let's give them some Nyssa sleeves because we can. Here we can rename the deck. I think we're going to call it the Forest, since it's mainly forests. And that's it. So that's our deck made. Now all we need to do is test it against a few opponents. So if we click finish, it takes us back to this statistics screen. We can have a look at the average converted mana cost, etc. there. Decide whether we've got a truly efficient deck, you know. From here we just save the changes, and there it is. There's our deck stored in with the rest of them. We've got the option here to foil the cards. If any of the cards in the deck aren't already foils, we've got the option here for a few in-game coins to turn the cards into foil cards. And foil cards just look better. So we're going to foil this deck up. Now it's ready to play. I'll record a couple of games of the deck in action. As we're nearly at the half-an-hour mark, I'll upload them as a separate video during the week ahead of next Magic Monday, when we'll speak about 2-colour decks. Until then, take it easy and I'll see you next time.